I'm Isa Suarez in London, and this is CNN.
We have an hour left to trade and a fairly mixed sort of day. Look at the big board and you'll see exactly what I mean. The way the market has traded all over. We were down sharply, but we've come back quite a lot. And actually, the losses were not that significant even when they were all the way down. So the market is holding its nerve. And we might even be positive before the end of the session. I wouldn't put money on it. Those are the markets. And the main events of the day, ahead of new talks with Russia, Ukraine's president says he'd accept neutrality in exchange for peace. The White House proposes a new minimum tax on the rich, how minimum is minimum, and a surge in ratings for the Oscars. Millions of people tuned in for that slap heard around the world. The question is, what happens next? We're live tonight at Expo 2020, live from Dubai. It is Monday, it's March the 28th. I'm Richard Quest, and yes, I mean business. Good evening. We begin tonight with Ukraine, of course, and a warning from the country that Russia is trying to cut off the capital and divide Ukraine into two. Now, there are going to be in-person peace talks being held in Istanbul, so this warning comes at the last moment before them. Ukraine's head of military intelligence has suggested that Russia is trying to create an occupied zone in the south. You can see it clearly on the map here between where you have Crimea, which of course has already been annexed, and you have the disputed area, which is now, of course, Donetsk and Luhansk, and that would create the land bridge that Russia is trying to seek, linking the Russian border to Crimea. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. It's only been able to reach it by the Kerch Straits, which you can see there. There's no land bridge per se. The mayor of Mariupol in southeast Ukraine is calling for the city's complete evacuation, as he says it's now in the hands of Russian occupiers after a nearly month-long siege. Ben Wiedemann joins me now. Ben, we'll deal with the political stuff in just a moment. Let's just first of all look at Mariupol, the inevitability. I mean, good Lord, who on earth could withstand that much bombardment at that level and hope to survive?
Yes, this is a city, Richard, that has been under what can only be described as a medieval siege for weeks. No gas, no electricity, no water, dwindling food supplies. And therefore, the mayor has basically said that he's calling for mass evacuations of the city's population because they simply cannot survive. Now, the problem is that a pro-Russian separatist leader today said that daily 1,700 people are being bussed out of the city to Russian-controlled areas. The Ukrainian government says that this is forced deportation. So the feeling is that despite the efforts of the defenders, despite the efforts of volunteers and the Ukrainian army, that this city may not be able to hold out much longer. In fact, President Zelensky said in an interview yesterday with 4 Russian journalists online that he had spoken to the mayor of Mariupol and said, if you must evacuate the city, the soldiers should evacuate the city. The soldiers apparently, he says, said that no, they will continue to fight and die for the city, that they want to leave at least with the dead, their dead and their wounded. But the situation is so desperate, it's hard to imagine that whatever is left of the city in Ukrainian hands can hold out for much longer. Richard?
Ben, the talks that are going to take place and this idea of Zelensky saying he would accept neutrality as the price for peace. Now, obviously, there's a long way to go between those statements and any agreement. But in your view, is this the start of something that could end up being a workable peace?
Well, this is one point that Vladimir Putin has demanded. Ukraine's neutrality. But what sort of neutrality? There has been discussion, for instance, that the Russians want the Ukrainian army to be limited to 50,000 soldiers. It's currently 5 times that number, and certainly for Ukraine to agree to something like that, many people would consider it suicide, given what's happened to this country in the last month. So, for instance, we heard the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan saying last week that 4 out of 6 points had been agreed to between the two sides. Now, we don't know precisely what that is, but perhaps those remaining 2 points are things that they simply cannot agree to. So we've seen multiple negotiations between the two sides, but until now, nothing has really come out of them. And there is, I have to tell you, having spoken to so many people here, there is a profoundly deep mistrust of Russian intentions, regardless of the words that are coming out of Moscow. But people look around. You just need to look around this city and see the destruction that has happened here. And people will tell you actions have spoken much louder than words. Richard?
Ben, thank you. Ben's in Ukraine tonight. And as the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are set to resume their peace talks face-to-face, those talks taking place in Istanbul, President Zelensky says that he's trying and ready to discuss Ukraine's official neutrality as part of the talks. He also says that any potential deal would have to be approved by a referendum. And he told the independent Russian journalists that he is responding to Russia's stated reasons for invading.
Security guarantees and our neutrality, the non-nuclear status of our state. We are ready to pursue this. This is the most important point. This was the first point of principle for the Russian Federation, as I recall. And as far as I remember, they started the war because of this.
Sir Peter Westmacott's with us, former British ambassador to the US, France and Turkey, and of course author of the excellent book, they call it Diplomacy, 40 Years of Representing Britain Abroad. You described Vladimir Putin in 3 words. Peter, what were they?
I think I said he was dishonest, reckless, and thuggish. Well, that was about 7 or 8 years ago.
Have your view changed?
Frankly, no. At the time, Richard, he was busy trying to fabricate evidence to suggest that it wasn't Russians or Russian weapons that shot down the Malaysian Airlines aircraft over Ukraine with a loss of almost 300 lives, and was busy also trying to fabricate other bits of disinformation justifying Russia's presence in eastern Ukraine. And I'm afraid that what's happened since then has not really led me to change my opinion. The Russian embassy complained what I'd said because I was then a British diplomat, but I didn't get any dressing down from London, and I suspect if I used the same language today, not many people would disagree.
So this idea of talks over neutrality and Zelensky's pretty much agreement that neutrality per se could be part of the deal. But as Ben Wiedemann says, there are a raft of other requirements from Putin and Zelensky that really make the neutrality the red herring.
Well, I think there's a lot in that. What I hear from the odd oligarch that I've spoken to is that Crimea remains, in Putin's mind, non-negotiable, but that a lot of the Russian speakers who are in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, feel so betrayed and let down by what Russia has done to them, what Putin's done to them, that they've got no desire to be under Russian control, and that they would be perfectly happy, more than that, to remain part of Ukraine. Conclusion, if there is a negotiated deal, it doesn't necessarily have to include the Donbass, but it probably does have to include Crimea. And those are the things that I think really matter, as far as I can understand it, to President Putin, as well as this nonsense about denazification and neutrality.
So the way it's being put forward, though, this idea of a deal to be done, I mean, how much of this brings back memories of 1930s? To do a deal to get peace now, but it's not really peace in our time.
I think a lot of it does. It is, frankly, pretty monstrous when you think about it.
That back. Did your words complicate matters?
Well, you asked 3 different questions. I'll answer them all. Number one, I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt.
We have the president who's answering questions at the White House.
The actions of this man, just brutality. Half the children in Ukraine. I just come from being with those families. And so, but I want to make it clear, I wasn't then, nor am I now, articulating a policy change. I was expressing the moral outrage that I feel, and I make no apologies for it.
Personal feelings, sir. Your personal feelings?
My personal feelings. Secondly, you asked me about, well, what was the second part?
Does it complicate the diplomacy of this moment?
No, I don't think it does. You know, the fact is that we're in a situation where what complicates the situation at the moment is the escalatory efforts of Putin to continue to engage in carnage, the kind of behavior that makes the whole world say, "My God, what is this man doing?" That's what complicates things a great deal, and but I don't think it complicates it at all.
Mr. President,
Let me go to Steve Holland, Reuters.
Mr. President, thank you. When you say that you're not walking anything back, you do feel that Vladimir Putin should be removed from power? Is that what you're saying? And
No, what I was expressing just what I said. I was expressing the moral outrage I felt towards this man. I wasn't articulating a policy change. And I think that, you know, he continues on this course that he's on. He is going to become a pariah worldwide, and who knows what he becomes at home in terms of support.
just to follow up, are you concerned this remark might escalate the conflict?
No, I'm not. I'm not at all.
What
Look,
not, sir? Thank you.
and you know, look, the other thing is that a couple people have asked me as well, might well speak to it unless you want to ask the question, but you know, that other governments have suggested that this is a problem, I'm escalating things. No. And has it weakened NATO? No, it hadn't. NATO has never, ever, 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 ever been as strong as it is today. Never.
so if saying he cannot remain in power does not mean regime change, what does it mean in your opinion?
It means that I would hope it was expressing my outrage. He shouldn't remain in power. Just like, you know, bad people shouldn't continue to do bad things. But it doesn't mean we have a fundamental policy to do anything to take Putin down in any way.
What made you add that? Because that wasn't in your prepared remarks, we were told. So what made you add that at the end, Mr. President?
Because I was talking to the Russian people. The last part of the speech was talking to the Russian people, telling them what we thought. And I was communicating this to not only the Russian people, but the whole world. This is just stating a simple fact that this kind of behavior is totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. And the way to deal with it is to strengthen and keep NATO completely united and help Ukraine where we can. Cleve, you had a question. Where is he?
Thanks, Mr. President. On your budget, you've said repeatedly at the State of the Union that you're not for defunding the police. I do wonder how much emphasis you think should be put on alternative forms of crime prevention, not just defunding the police, but you know, crime reduction in communities.
Oh, a significant amount. I've laid that out in detail in the budget. For example, we do know that intervention programs work. We do know that what police need, they need psychologists in the department as much as they need extra rifles. They need people who are in the department who can deal with the crisis that the police are going through as well, dealing with their crises, dealing with their mental state and how they're handling things. They need social workers engaged with them. I lay it all out. And it all works. If you see these community intervention programs, they work. They actually reduce crime. They significantly reduce crime. So that's a big piece of it.
Just to follow up, is any of it related to political pressure from Republicans saying that Democrats are soft on crime, that, that you guys are careening to the left?
Isn't it kind of fascinating? When I first got elected, I was being beat up because I supported the police too much for the previous 30 years. No, that's what I think. Ozma.
Well, surprised to get called. Thank you, Mr. President. Are you willing to try to meet with Vladimir Putin? And I have a quick follow-up to that. When you last met with him face-to-face in Geneva, you had described that as a productive conversation. You said that he did not want a Cold War. And do you feel, given the actions, though, that have happened over the last few months, I guess I'm asking what has changed in his mind?
I don't know what's changed his mind. His behavior's changed. When we met, remember what we were talking about. We were talking about setting up a strategic dialogue and talking about the relationship of NATO and Russia and facing off in the regions and how we could have more transparency and all the rest. It was a normal discussion I had going all the way back to Kosygin and others back in 100 years ago when I was a young senator. And so what changed was nothing remotely approaching that. Remember when he first met with me, he said, I have two objectives. This is the second or third time I met with him. He said, I have two objectives. One is to make sure that they never become part of NATO, and two, to make sure there are no long-range missiles in there, in Ukraine. I said, we can deal with the second one easily, but we can't close the door on the first. Because when we talk about missiles, we want to talk about what's also on the Russian border heading toward Europe. Do both. And then if you notice that demand list of his, not with me, with others, have escalated significantly in terms of what he thinks is necessary. Thank you very much.
We need some more clarification, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know you're going to ask a really nice question.
Well, it's an important question, I think. Are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back?
What's getting walked back?
It made it sound like, just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon, and it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia, and we know...
None of the three occurred.
None of the three occurred?
None of the three.
Mr. President?
You interpret the language that way. I was talking to the troops. We were talking about helping train the troops that are the Ukrainian troops that are in Poland. That's what the context. I sat there with those guys for a couple hours. That's what we talked about.
So when you said you're going to see when you're there, you were not intending to see...
I was referring to meeting with and talking with the Ukrainian troops that were in Poland.
And when you said a chemical weapon use by Russia would trigger a response in kind?
It will trigger a significant response.
What does that mean?
I'm not going to tell you. Why would I tell you? You got to be silly.
The world wants to know?
The world wants to know a lot of things. I'm not telling them what the response would be. Then Russia knows the response.
Mr. President.
All right, I'm going to take two more questions. 1, 2.
Mr. President, thank you. I still want to get back to your original words that he cannot remain in power. Can you help us understand, you have more foreign policy experience than any president who has ever held this office. Whether those are your personal feelings or your feelings as president, do you understand why people would believe you, as someone commanding one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, saying someone cannot remain in power is a statement of U.S. policy? And also, are you concerned about propaganda use of those remarks by the Russians?
No and no.
Tell me why. You have so much experience. You are the leader of this country.
Because it's ridiculous. Nobody believes we're going to take down, I was talking about taking down Putin. Nobody believes that. Number one. Number two, what have I been talking about since this all began? The only war that's worse than one intended is one that's unintended. The last thing I want to do is engage in a land war or a nuclear war with Russia. That's not part of it. I was expressing my outrage at the behavior of this man. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. And it's more an aspiration than anything. He shouldn't be in power. There's no, I mean, people like this shouldn't be ruling countries, but they do. The fact they do, but doesn't mean I can't express my outrage about it. Last question.
Thank you. You've said that you're confident that your comment won't undermine diplomatic efforts. But just to be clear, are you confident that Vladimir Putin sees it that way, that he will not use this as an escalatory?
I don't care what he thinks. Look, here's the deal. He's going to do what he's going to do. Putin, look.
But you're not concerned that he may see your language and view that as a sign of a reason for escalation, use that as an excuse to escalate, given his recent behavior?
Given his recent behavior, you should, excuse me, I shouldn't say that to you. Given his recent behavior, people should understand that he is going to do what he thinks he should do, period. He's not affected by anybody else, including, unfortunately, apparently his own advisors. This is a guy who goes to the beat of his own drummer. And the idea that he is going to do something outrageous because I called him for what he was and what he's doing, I think is just not rational.
You didn't say whether you'd meet him again. Would you meet with President Putin ever again?
It depends. No, it's not a question of the question is there something to meet on that would justify him being able to end this war and be able to rebuild Ukraine? That's the issue.
Can you just say yes or no, Mr. President, whether or not you would be willing to meet with President Putin
It depends
again?
on what he wants to talk about.
Thank you. Okay, last question.
What if he wanted to talk about negotiations? Now, what if he
Hello,
wanted to?
you said Supreme Court. Now, don't play that.
Well, you can't leave that hanging. Just real quick, two matters on the Supreme Court. While you were away, there were reports about the wife of Justice Thomas and texts that she had with former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Should Justice Thomas recuse himself from any cases involving the January 6th insurrection or former President Trump at this point?
I'd leave that to two entities.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Ask the second question.
No, two entities. Go ahead. Sorry.
One, the January 6th committee, and two, the Justice Department. That's their judgment, not mine to make.
So, on Justice Thomas recusing, you don't think he should, or?
I said that. I told you those things get into legal issues. That in fact, I told you I would not tell the Justice Department what position to take or not take, and I'm not going to instruct the Congress either.
And did you get any chance to watch much of the Judiciary Committee hearings
I didn't get a chance
last week?
to see any of it, unfortunately.
The fact that Republicans were questioning Judge Jackson on matters like former sentences related to child pornography cases or the definition of a woman, does that, as the former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, make sense to you?
Look, this is one of the most qualified nominees ever nominated for the Supreme Court in every respect, in terms of her disposition, her intellectual capacity, her experience and background, serving on three additional courts, a woman who is totally, thoroughly qualified, and will be a great addition to the court in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. Do you think that Russia is behind the alleged poisoning of those Ukrainians?
Well, the president, a fiery exchange with the press. Kevin Liptak is at the White House. Sir Peter Westmacott is still with me. Kevin, I'll let you have the first go at this.
Yeah.
He can't get rid of this, Kevin. He cannot get rid of this off-the-cuff comment. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, does it seem like the press is hounding a dog that won't hunt?
Well, I think that the press raised some fair questions here, and the president is clearly trying to draw a distinction between his personal view of Vladimir Putin and the U.S. government view of Vladimir Putin, and whether there can actually be a difference between those two things when you're the president of the United States, I think remains an open question here. And he's saying that what he was talking about when he said Putin cannot remain in power was his personal view, and it was derived from this emotion after having met these refugees at the National Stadium in Warsaw. Clearly he was touched by that, moved by that. It was at that stadium that he called Vladimir Putin a butcher, and then he came out to give this speech, and those 9 words at the end were sort of tacked on because of what he was feeling. But he was saying that he was not articulating any new policy, that the U.S. is not actively trying to remove Putin from power. Whether or not that's actually a distinction that can exist when you're the president of the United States, when people look to you for articulating American policy, I think that's an open question.
So, Peter, does it matter? I mean, he said he didn't mean to say what he said, and it's not policy, and so forth. With your experience of foreign policy and leaders speaking off the cuff, has he made the situation worse for himself?
Clearly, what he has done, Richard, is made an expression of hope in using such language as it looks like it's a change of American policy. And what he has said very firmly is, no, it's not. This is my sense of outrage. I don't think the guy should be there. But of course, the United States government is not into regime change. That's in essence what he's saying. I personally think it's something of a distraction from what really matters, which is to try to stop the slaughter and the suffering, and to show that somebody who illegally invades the next door country is not going to be rewarded for it. But it is a bit of a distraction for the time being. Is it escalatory? No, I actually rather agree with the president's view that President Putin is going to do what he wants to do, irrespective of what President Macron, President Putin, Boris Johnson, or anybody, President Biden or Boris Johnson actually say about it. He's worked out what he wants to do. He worked out how he wishes to behave. He will use language used by other heads of government as a means to kind of justify what he's doing when he thinks it can. But I don't think it alters the substance.
Kevin in Washington, Peter in London. Thank you both. I appreciate it. Thank you. Sure. Questions Business tonight coming from Dubai Expo 2020. What the president was actually doing there was a press conference about his new budget. Well, we didn't hear too much about it. We will after the break. That new budget includes a new billionaire income tax that's supposed to apply to unrealized investment income too. You know the rules. It's when you haven't actually sold anything, but you still get taxed on it. We'll talk about it after the break.
A Mediterranean diet offers a number of health benefits. Here are some easy steps to start your journey into the Mediterranean style of eating. Cook with extra virgin olive oil instead of butter, margarine, or refined oils like soybean and canola oil. Add foods rich in healthy fats to recipes and snacks. These include sunflower seeds, nuts, olives, and avocados. Choose whole grain bread and pasta instead of the refined varieties, and eat less red meat. Instead, add fish and other seafood to a few meals each week. Also, snack on lots of fruits and vegetables. Adding a starter salad to each meal is a great way to get more greens. Now for the beverages. Water should be your first choice. Also, switch from whole milk to a 1% skim or milk alternatives like almond milk.
When you travel the world, make sure the world travels with you. Check in, log on, and get connected with all of the latest developments at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels. Connected to your world.
This is the result of one single blast.
3.3 million Ukrainians have now fled this country.
You don't have to go far to find a family who has been displaced.
We just heard an air raid siren ring out.
We run down for cover. It is hard to imagine life returning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro,
Poland.
This is CNN.
I'm Sam Abdulaziz in the Carpathian Mountains, and this is CNN.
Questions Business, good evening tonight. Italy's largest utility company, says it's preparing to leave Russia. Enel's CEO calls the situation there unpalatable and impossible. His company joins Shell and BP, who've already said they will no longer invest in Russia. Now, Enel's Russian operations include several wind farms and 3 gas-fired heat and power plants. Enel's operations in Russia represent about 1% of its overall business. And Francesco Starace is the chief executive of the company. He joins me from Rome. Sir, thank you, and thank you for waiting with us this evening. I understand that the actual amount is not that significant in terms of the productive capacity, but it's the message, isn't it? It's actually making the decision that Russia is not a place where your company wishes to be now or in the near future.
Well, it's regretfully so, and I have to say that with some sadness, because we had a very good experience in Russia so far. But clearly the situation is difficult to manage. And remember, we have not a small shop that we have to shut down and walk away. This is a large operation with 3 large power plants that feed energy to the Russian network and heat to 3 large Russian cities. So we have a responsibility to keep them running. It will be very difficult to do so under the present embargo. We cannot import spare parts. It's going to be difficult to run these plants efficiently going forward. So we don't have much of a choice here, at this point.
What will you do? Will you transfer them to a local entity? Will you sell them off? Will you somehow find a way to trust them into some third entity? What will you do?
Well, actually, the 3 alternatives are exactly the ones that you have just listed, and they're all up in the air at this moment. So we are going to find the best way, hoping that the situation in Russia will evolve in a more positive way, and it will be possible for us to come back and do business in that country. In the present situation, this is clearly impossible.
And if we talk about Europe now and the European drive to wean itself off Russian oil and gas, how realistic, I mean, of course it can be done at a cost to countries like Germany, Austria and Hungary, where there are large takers. But how realistic is it to do this in a short period of time?
I think it's more realistic than it looks. And I would like to say that this was already the intent of Europe. Europe had a view that the dependence from fossil fuels in general, not just the Russian ones, in general, needed to be reduced because Europe is importing these fossil fuels at a high cost from all parts of the world. So economically, it was a good idea to get and to minimize the use of fossil fuels in general. Coal, gas and oil coming from different parts of the world. And the green revolution, the Green Deal that Europe started with the President Commission was in that direction. So is it possible to accelerate? I think under the present circumstances and in the urgency that this comes about, I think yes, it is possible. It will take a period of 3 to 5 years, but it is possible.
Right. You say 3 to 5 years, of course, they're hoping to do it quicker. But what I'm interested in is, how did we miss the signals? I mean, after 2014 and Crimea, we continued, or Europe continued with Nord Stream 2, when clearly that was only going to make the reliance worse. It's almost as if Europe sleptwalked towards this problem.
I think there is a tendency on systems to try and find the path of less resistance, and that was what happened in 2014. So I think this is a lesson that we all have to learn for the future. Let's not forget there was another incident before that. That was the Libyan disaster, and not, Europe is importing gas from Libya. Was importing gas from Libya to a large extent, and now that gas is basically almost nothing because of the war that raged in that country. So we had not one, but 2 opportunities to really think hard how much we want to depend on fossil fuels coming from different sources and, let's say, special situations. And I think that lesson learned this time should be taken for serious.
I'm grateful to you, sir, tonight for joining us. I appreciate it. Thank you, sir. It's Quest Means Business. We are at Expo 2020 in Dubai. More after the break.
When you're on a motorcycle, you're experiencing the world in such a different way. When you hit the open road and there's nothing but kind of the sunset that you're chasing, it really does give you a sense of what it means to be alive. My name is Lauren Trantham, and I'm the founder and executive director of Ride My Road. Ride My Road is a fundraising organization. We primarily operate within the motorcycle community to raise funds and awareness around the topics of human trafficking in the United States. In 2016, I was going through a divorce, and it was a really tough time for me. And so I decided to jump on my motorcycle and take my camera. I did 10,000 miles across America. I photographed 40 survivors. That was really how I began this journey, was more as a personal project as a photographer, with just this idea, this thought that can we heal a broken heart through helping others? Survivors are literally the best among us. They have persevered and have so much resilience, and we have so much to learn from them. We look at vulnerable people and think that maybe they're just cast aside or they're not important, but I think really we need to look to them if we want to move forward on issues like human trafficking.
The World Bank economist says farms can help sustain international trade through the challenges that have come up over the last few years. Vicky Chumtai spoke to Zain Asher from the DP World Pavilion at Dubai Expo 2020.
So the past few years, we've seen a setback in trade, in global trade, everything from the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chain issues, the US-China trade war as well, more recently higher oil prices. What can governments around the world do to ensure that their economies become much more resilient to external shocks?
One sort of easy getaway is probably to increase the resilience and adaptability of farms in this global trading landscape.
And it's important to have a multi-pronged approach with all of this because, of course, yes, the goal is to increase global trade and investment, but at the same time, you also have to think about sustainability and inclusivity as well. How do you do both?
I think there are two ways to look at it. There's a role for the policymakers, there's a role for international organizations, and then there's a role for the private sector in itself. Now, when you look at the role for the international organizations in trying to negotiate sort of these trade and sustainability rules, they need to amp up and increase the amount of ambition that they currently have. In today's trading landscape, landscape, right? When you think about all of the different initiatives, both from the private sector and the public sector, when you think about carbon mitigation targets by different multinational corporations, or different schemes such as the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, you see that all consumers are pushing the governments to act upon the sustainability agenda by putting in place some of these policies. And how are farms going to trade? They really need to show that they have low carbon intensities in their production processes. But once you have that good carbon traceability infrastructure, farms are able to trade much better in a more sustainable way and be able to showcase that they indeed actually have a carbon competitive advantage. And there's also the role of of developing countries, right? Oftentimes we always think that the developing countries probably do not have such a huge role to play. But what we're increasingly seeing, if you look at the growth rates of carbon emissions over the past 10 years or so, you'll see that actually the smaller countries are carbonizing at a much faster rate than the developed world. Adaptation is critical for smaller countries, but so is mitigation and decarbonization, because that sort of gives you that good base for a green growth that creates the good jobs for the future and creates competitiveness that is useful for trading in today's trading landscape.
President Biden has unveiled his new budget. It weighs in at $5.8 trillion, and it comes with a billionaire tax. The billionaire minimum income tax would require households with net worth over $100 million to pay at least 20% of their full income in taxes. Now, that would include unrealized investment income. Half of the revenue is expected to come from billionaire households. President Biden explained why the billionaire tax was necessary as he introduced his budget today.
Right now, billionaires pay an average rate of 8% on their total income. 8%, that's the average they pay. Now, I'm a capitalist, but if you can make $1 billion, great. Just pay your fair share, pay a little bit. A firefighter and a teacher pay more than double the tax rate that a billionaire pays. That's not right. That's not fair. And my budget contains a billionaire minimum tax because of that.
Now, the White House budget announced include a fresh warning that the war in Ukraine is going to hit food supplies. The president's top economic advisor said the conflict is driving up prices. Just last week, President Biden warned of global shortages. Before the invasion, Ukraine and Russia produced 30% of the world's wheat. Both nations are also an important source of fertilizer used on farms worldwide. Soren Bjorn is the president of Driscoll's. His company controls around a third of the US berry market. He joins me now. It's a long way from your California fields, if you will, to the war in Ukraine, to the supply chains problems of China. But what you're exhibiting is the difficulties and the enmeshed global market. How's it hitting you?
Yeah, I mean, on the farm, we are definitely feeling it, right? I mean, fertilizer and other input costs are up 40 to 100%. And that's if you can get everything. A lot of the specialty inputs, like for organic production, is actually quite difficult to get these days.
If we take fertilizer, for example, where Ukraine is a large producer of the necessary components, and you look at just the simple logistics of getting exports out and around the world, what do you need most from government now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to make sure we have alternative sources of supply, right? And so anything we can do to ease up supply chain constraints. And that has been a major issue throughout the pandemic. It looks like it's getting a little better, right? But I think government really need to look at all those places in the world where things are getting stuck and what can they do to help keep things moving. That's probably the single biggest thing they can do in the short term.
You see, what's interesting is we were, for so many years, people like you, business leaders were told just-in-time supply chain, don't hold too much inventory, watch the costs and hedge. As I see you smiling, in a sense, it's you know, because what you're now learning is that that's actually cost you dear.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, and it sort of comes at an interesting time, right? Because really the cost of holding inventory has been relatively cheap because interest rates have been so low, and now interest rates are going up. And there is no doubt about that businesses like ours need to keep more inventory. And so you see that throughout the world. And I also think that's creating some additional pressures in the short term, right? You know, as people are sort of out there making sure they have enough inventory, they want to call it hoarding, you know, then that puts more pressure on the entire supply chain. And with everything else going on, that makes it really challenging in the short term.
What do you believe is the price elasticity of your various berries and fruits? You know, which is sort of a posh way of saying how much inflation, price rises can you shove on before people will stop buying?
Well, you know, I mean, if you're in a category like berries, which is highly, highly perishable, you know, we do not have the luxury of putting our berries into inventory for a little while or send out a price list and say, hey, we're going to take the price up. I mean, that's not how our business works, right? There's a total amount of supply, there's a total amount of demand out there this week, and that ends up with a certain price. And so in the short term, there's not much we can do. We will sell every single berry we produce every week. What we harvest today is probably sold tomorrow. And so in the short term, there's not that much we can do. The most important thing we can do in our category is to keep the demand high. And so berries is not something where you can take out a little bit of quality and lower the cost, then the demand will really fall off. So our strategy is the opposite, is keep pushing quality up and demand will stay good.
So, and related to that, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, you've got an issue with migrant workers and getting people to pick the stuff. You've got now an issue with supply chain. You've got fertilizer problems. You've also got this potentially 6 or 7 interest rate rises. So you've got to get your balance sheet and your medium and long-term debt sorted out. It's amazing you sleep at night.
Well, I mean, in some ways, the pandemic was really good for demand in our business, right? So we are actually coming out of the pandemic really, really strong. But we will have to make the investments in technology and other things to make sure that we can continue to grow our business. And that's what we committed to. We're producing more berries this year than last year. We want to produce more berries next year than this year. And that's what we committed to. But investments in technology is going to be a critical component to make that happen.
Right. Søren, thank you. I think I've said before to you on this program, your blueberries grace my breakfast table on a regular basis. Delicious out of the freezer. Thank you, sir. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Now, as we continue tonight, Quest Means Business, it is the slap heard around the world. Will Smith's controversial Oscars moment and has now put the Academy to its best ratings in years.
Over the last 2 years, we have begun to realize that this is not something that's going to go away. And I think the more we read about the experts talking about it, we recognize that this is something we're going to have to live with. I do hope, though, a year from now, though, we don't have this very high number of infections at once that disrupt so much of society. And we end up in something, look, we live with the flu. Every year in the winter, we have a flu vaccine that we go and we get. And some people get sick, and hopefully we'll be in that sort of a situation, and it'd be wonderful if we can be, because this is very disruptive to what we're trying to accomplish. Supply demand drives the price of an airline ticket or a hotel reservation right now. So if you end up with a situation where people all of a sudden are not traveling, you'll have a slight decrease in the price. Long term, though, I feel you end up with an equilibrium. We'll get back to something a little bit more normal.
special ongoing season of the Tug of War podcast. CNN reporters are on the ground in Ukraine, documenting Russia's invasion, the escalating conflict, and what it means for the rest of the world. Tug of War. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Will Smith slap propelled the Oscars to its best numbers, viewing numbers, for years. You know what happened? Chris Rock made the joke, Smith took against it, and then there was this.
Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it. All right? that was a nice one. Okay. I'm out here. Richard. Oh, wow. Wow. Will Smith.
Now, a source says the Academy considered removing Smith from the ceremony, but couldn't make the decision fast enough. It's now condemned his actions and is exploring further consequences for the actor. The slap actually overshadowed Smith's Oscar win for the Best Actor, as well as a historic first at the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards Coda, a film from Apple TV Plus, won the Best Picture, which is the first time a streaming service has earned the top prize. Brian Stelter is with me. Brian, I know you wish to talk about Apple Plus and streaming and getting terribly excited about that. I want to talk about Will Smith's slap. What are they going to do?
That's the human being's brain in a nutshell right there. That's right. The business story is Apple. Apple's celebrating. We know that. But Will Smith and Chris Rock, this isn't over. This is not over because Chris Rock has not really commented on what happened or how he felt. Will Smith apologized to the Academy but didn't apologize to Chris Rock. There's still something between these two men, and it has the whole world talking. And I do think it seeks the double standards for celebrities, Richard. If somebody slapped you or I smacked us on the street like that, there'd probably be police activity involved. But not in this case. And the Academy's excuses are really weak. They're saying, well, we were all sitting in different places in the room, so we couldn't get our plan together about how to deal with this before he won for Best Actor. There's a lot of tensions here, including the fact that a lot of celebrities in the room were cheering for Will Smith. They were excited to see him win the award, but it was all in the aftermath of that smack.
By the way, I was talking to a lawyer on the West Coast who says that even though Rock hasn't made a complaint, the prosecutors, the DA and the local prosecutors could go against him on public policy grounds, but they don't want anything to do with it. Nobody wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole.
Because celebrities really are not just like us. Even though, that famous Us Weekly magazine feature from years ago, celebrities, they're just like us. The truth is actually more about what Donald Trump said a decade ago on that Access Hollywood tape, actually 2 decades ago. He said, if you're a celebrity, they'll let you do it. And this is another version of that. The Academy now says they're going to explore further action. But what kind of further action could that mean? It's been almost 24 hours, and their lack of action is what speaks volumes.
So I'm British. We always root for the underdog. I felt sorry for Netflix. They did the hard work of getting streaming services up, running, moving, on the agenda, and Apple Plus, latecomer, swoops in and takes it.
This is another historic moment, Richard. The words Netflix and underdog were just used in a sentence together for the first time. The idea that Netflix is the underdog, I know exactly what you're getting at. They were behind the power of